right, everyone, let's get started. Thank you. Welcome. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to First Fridays. I am Linnea Anderson, a member of the committee and the archivist of the Social Welfare History Archives. Welcome back to our regular guests and a special welcome to any of you who are here for the first time. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former Library Director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. This year's theme is Roaring Good Tales, Animals in the Archives, and we have a presentation today from the James Ford Bell Library. Also, a reminder that we are streaming this program on the library's Facebook. That's available upstairs in 308. If there's any of you who don't have a seat, you're welcome to take the elevator on the opposite side of the building up to the third floor and follow the signs. And the video will also be available later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel. There will be a tour after the program today with Chris Kiesling. Chris, in the back over there. Thanks. Terrific. And before we move on to the rest of the program, we have a short announcement from Kirsten Clark about Friends of the Libraries.
Great. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kirsten Clark. I work here in the libraries, but I'm also on the board of the Friends of the Library. Your attendance here is obviously a definite support of the collections that we have here, but there's a couple other ways you could also provide support. Several of our collections have friends groups for themselves, including one based that's going to tie in with our presenters today, presenter today, the Associates of the James Ford Bell. We also have the Treader Collection, the Curlin Friends, Friends of the Anderson Horticultural Library, Friends of the Sherlock Holmes Collections, and then our larger Friends of the Libraries. If you're interested in learning more about any of those, there's some information at the back table. So stop by there, and thank you, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Kirsten. Our presentation today is Fantastic Beasts, Find Them in the Bell Library, presented by Margaret Ragnow, curator of the James Ford Bell Library. In a world where medieval unicorns and mermaids represented the familiar as much as cats and horses, early modern Europeans often had difficulty making sense of the many new species they encountered on their travels around the world. Nevertheless, they approached all of these creatures with curiosity and wonder. Let's join Maggie from the Bell Library for a look into this fascinating history of strange beasts and beasties.
Thank you, Linnea, and thanks everyone for coming out on this cold and somewhat snowy day. So as has been mentioned, Animals in the Archives is this year's theme for First Fridays, and we certainly do have a lot of them. Since the Bell Library dates to before 1800, I'm going to take you back in time to look at some historic images of animals. Our relationship with animals is complex today, and it was in the pre-modern world as well. We bring animals into our homes to become part of our families. We play with them, we hunt with them, and we hunt them. We eat them, experiment with them, and protest on their behalf. We create laws to protect them. Their body parts end up on our walls, in our medicine, on our necklaces, and in our furniture. We capture them, and then we visit them in zoos. And we teach them to perform tricks for a paying public. We employ them as actors and representatives of a wide variety of products, from phonographs to shopping emporiums, from breakfast cereal to insurance. Perhaps surprisingly, for those of you who think of the Bell Library as a collection of materials about European expansion and exploration, we actually have a lot of animals in our collection. And I'm taking a risk in speaking about them today, because so many people think that we are the library of the Bell Museum of Natural History, which has a much more public face. And in fact, we're both named after James Ford Bell. He was a member of the University Board of Regents for more than 40 years and was a driving force in developing the Natural History Museum. And they named it after him, renamed it after him when he died in 1961. But the Bell Library was his personal legacy to the university, which opened in 1953 with some of his personal book collection and others purchased by the university, and now we have more than 40,000 items in the collection. So despite that, I just know that when some people see that I'm doing this talk, it will cement in their minds forever that we are part of the Bell Museum. But nevertheless, let's begin. All right. So there are 3 categories of animal images in the Bell Library's collection: natural depictions of real animals, depictions of real animals as they are described to somebody who's never seen them, and mythological and fantastical animals. Several animals in the second category also fall into the third category based on the relationship of the drawings to reality. And there are some who will question whether some animals that I'm placing in the mythological category were actually mythological. So, natural-looking depictions of real animals can be found throughout the collection, not only in books by naturalists, although that's probably the dominant resource, particularly for books published in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, this is the ooh and ah, isn't it cute portion of my talk today, so feel free as you look at the slides. So not quite so fuzzy, but beautiful photograph. So this fish and creatures on the next 2 slides are hand-colored engravings found in a Russian book by Ivan Ivanovich Lepkin, who lived from 1740 to 1802, who was a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's mainly known as the leader of one of 5 expeditions organized by the Academy in 1768 to study the natural resources of Russia and to collect ethnographic and economic data. In the first 3 years of the expedition, which consisted of Lepkin and 6 companions, he traveled from Moscow, and they were supposed to proceed as far as Tobolsk and then return to St. Petersburg. At Tyumen, however, where he spent the 3rd winter, Lepkin was granted permission to travel instead into northern European Russia, to the area around the White Sea. In 1772, the expedition left Tyumen and traveled to Archangel, and from Archangel they explored the White Sea coast, the Solovetsky Islands, and the Cannon Peninsula. They then returned to St. Petersburg, and in 1773, Lepkin led a 9-month expedition to investigate Belarus. The 4 volumes that record these expeditions were published between 1771 and 1805, so 1 volume every few years. So this is very awe-worthy. In our 3-volume edition of this work, the images are all at the back of volume 3, and they are all fabulous, and this is just a hint of what they are. And in fact, it was really difficult for me to decide which of all the many animals in the collections I was going to show you and what stories to tell, because there were so many. So if you have a favorite animal that you've actually seen in the collection and it's not here, I'm sorry. But I had to make choices, or we'd be here all day. So in addition to these lush hand-colored drawings by Lepkin, we also have more prosaic images. For example, this first one is a description of a whale hunt with the deceased whale in evidence. We have a North American turkey, which was certainly a novelty, and then a reindeer working in harness in Lapland. One of the most interesting sources for animals that we have in the collection is an old medieval encyclopedia. It's written in Old French. Our copy is from the late 14th century. It's based on a late 13th century original. It's handwritten with illustrations, decorations, and illumination on parchment, on animal skin, all done by hand. And of the 14 or so of these old French editions that are known to exist, they all have some animals, but they don't all have the same animals. And they are drawn by different artists, and so the animals don't all look alike. So here is a page from that shows from the animals section. And up here we have what I think is a fox. This may be a mouse because it looks suspiciously like what the cat has in its mouth. And I'll let you take a close-up look at that. Animals are often drawn during this period with very expressive faces, and the cat is certainly an example of this. And here we have another one. The bird's not all that great, but the owl is quite a character. I'm drawing your attention to their faces because there's a strong tendency to anthropomorphize animals during this period. They were used allegorically, as in this Lion King. This is a book that's talking about the relationship of the Turks to the Holy Roman Empire. And also they were used to humanize often very scary animals, such as this marsupial, which is a totally human face, but take a look at the very wicked claws at the bottom. So this brings me to my second category of animals, which is perhaps one of the most challenging things for us as modern viewers of some of these animals depicted by artists of the pre-modern world, are those animals that were drawn but never actually seen by the artists. And I suspect this marsupial may be one of them. A famous example is the rhinoceros drawn by the renowned Renaissance artist and engraver Albrecht Dürer. And it comes with a bit of a story, so bear with me. The voyage of exploration around the Horn of Africa by Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama at the end of the 15th century opened a dialogue of sorts between the King of Portugal and the sultans of India. Gift exchange had, and actually still is, a long tradition used to cement diplomatic relationships, and it certainly was during this period. In 1515, when Alfonso de Albuquerque, who was the governor of Portuguese Goa in India, traveled back to Lisbon, he did so on a ship laden with ivory, ivory furniture, and other valuable gifts, and a live rhinoceros. Certainly, this was included as a gift from Muzaffar Sultan II, Sultan of Cambay, to King Manuel I of Portugal, the Shah II. When Albuquerque ship docked in Lisbon and the rhino was led ashore, unquestionably it attracted a crowd. It was the first time a rhinoceros had been seen in Europe since Europe had been part of the Roman Empire. Rhinoceros had been brought to Rome for games in the Colosseum, where it was recorded by Pliny, a Roman scholar and naturalist. Given the name Ulysses, the beast took up residence in Manuel's royal menagerie, where it continued to attract crowds. Its fame traveled all over Europe, including Germany, which is how Dürer came to hear about it. Among the curious who flocked to the National Palace or who stood in the streets to watch the parade of the rhinoceros were many scholars and scientists. They certainly had read the writings of Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and other ancient scholars. And here is what Pliny has to say about the rhinoceros. In the same games, we also showed the rhinoceros with a horn on its nose. We saw often this, since it is the second natural enemy of the elephant. And from what I can tell of Pliny, the first natural enemy is man. It sharpens its horn against the rocks and is thus preparing for battle, seeking above all to reach the stomach that it knows is the most vulnerable part. It is as long as the elephant, it has much shorter legs, and is the color of a bourse, which is a lead pipe. A German printer living in Lisbon, Valentin Fernand, sent a letter and a drawing of the beast to the merchant community at Nuremberg, in which he detailed the physiognomic characteristics of the rhinoceros. Dürer read the letter. It's unclear whether he actually saw the sketch, and apparently struck by the strangeness of the animal, he sketched it himself based on the description. So here is Durer's rhinoceros. So it's pretty close to that description. It's recognizable to us as a rhino. It still offers kind of a fanciful depiction. He added on the neck a little unicorn-like horn, which you can see right here. He drew skin that sometimes has been described as the plates of a carapace of a crustacean. Others see it as armor. Its legs are scaly, like a reptile or bird's legs, and he appended the tail of an elephant over there. Through representations of this print, the rediscovery of the rhinoceros had an effect of confirming the truthfulness of Pliny's account and strengthened its authority among the scientists of the day. Durer's engraving achieved such great success throughout Europe that we believe nearly 5,000 copies of the print were circulated before he died. Now, in the Bell collection, we have a copy of Durer's rhinoceros that can be found in our 1550 edition of Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia, which was printed in Basel, Switzerland. As you can see here, and I'm going to show them side by side, there are differences, but the same general features appear. Durer's is clearly better, not prejudiced or anything. And here is what a real Indian rhinoceros looks like. So I don't think Durer did too badly. Now, there's a sad coda to the story of Ulysses. He was eventually sent to Rome as a gift from King Manuel to Pope Leo X, but the ship never reached its destination. It ran aground on the coast of Liguria, taking to the depths of the Mediterranean perhaps the most famous rhinoceros in early modern art. Now, all of that was about an animal that Europeans had actually heard of, and some had actually seen. At least there were written descriptions of people who had actually seen a rhinoceros. The animals of the New World posed an entirely different problem. Beginning with Columbus's accounts of his voyage across the Atlantic, which came hard on the heels of the Europe-wide dissemination of movable type technology, the adventures of Europeans in the New World were a favored subject in an era that produced knowledge for widespread distribution on an unprecedented scale. So how did Europeans understand the new creatures they encountered in the lands on the far side of the Atlantic? 16th century European knowledge was grounded in Christian readings of ancient authors, like Pliny, but also like Aristotle, whose knowledge of fauna was cataloged and explicated in the numerous encyclopedias of the Middle Ages, like the Illuminated Encyclopedia by Bartholomeus Anglicus, from which I've already shown you some images. It was enhanced by personal experience and texts on practical subjects such as hunting, husbandry, medical treatises, which discussed animal products or parts used in specific treatments. This view of the natural world was challenged by New World animals, which were not only unlike anything previously considered or encountered, but also defied the ability of contemporary European language to describe them. And so here we have a description of an armadillo by a Spaniard who actually went to the New World. And so he is describing something that he has seen. In this land, there is a small animal, no bigger than a piglet. Its feet and hands are like those of a horse, and its head is like a small horse with little ears. It is covered with a shell from ears to tail so that it looks like an armored horse. They are beautiful to look at and graze like a horse. And someone has drawn that image. So now, here is a depiction of the armadillo by Nicolas Menardes from the English translation of his work, which we have in the collection. Menardes had never actually seen a living armadillo. He was a medical doctor in Seville and a purveyor of drugs he manufactured himself through his import company, which imported animals and plants from the New World. However, given the relative accuracy of his drawing here, I suspect that someone had sent him a specimen of an armadillo so that he actually saw and drew what he saw, instead of trying to describe it the way the other fellow did. After seeing it for the first time in the Americas, and I just didn't believe this when I read about it, 16th century Spain sparked an armadillo craze across Europe. People bought household objects that contained armadillo images. Its images was produced on maps, in manuscripts, and printed books. Elites collected the carapace in curio cabinets, and it was one of the first display items in the first museums. Its features reminded people of a war horse and war technology, the armor. Its descriptions subsequently inspired the proto-field of animal taxonomy. 16th century Spanish historians, like the ones that I've discussed here, were the primary sources for this European fascination with the armadillo. I mean, who knew? I've got to find an artifact now that has an armadillo on it. Yeah, this is one of my favorite animals in the collection. It says capivard or water hog on the image. It's a capybara. And actually, it was one of the first images I discovered when I started here as curator, and I used it on the first holiday card that we sent out after that, because it was just so cute. So, you know, when I looked at it, even though it shows that he's almost as tall as the banana tree that he's leaning against, I just assumed because he was cute that he was really, really tiny. And that they had simply exaggerated his size, which they were wont to do. And that's actually true, but not as much as I'd imagined, because this is an actual capybara. Still cute, but they get to be 3.5 to 4.5 feet in length. When they're standing on all fours, as much as 2 feet tall, and they can weigh about, the males weigh about 100 pounds as adults. The females can weigh more. Just for reference, even a dwarf banana tree averages 8 to 10 feet high. So it is out of proportion, but he's a much larger creature than I had imagined. And so they inhabit savannas and dense forests in South America, but always live near water. They're partially amphibious. They're highly social and can be found living in groups as large as 100, but usually in groups of 10 to 20. They're not a threatened species, but they are hunted for meat and for their hides, and also for grease from its fatty skin, which is used in the pharmaceutical trade. They apparently do fairly well in captivity, and you can find them in zoos, particularly in South America. Humans can pet them, but it's recommended that we don't, because they attract a particularly nasty disease-carrying tick. So look at them from afar, or enjoy the image of them. So early explorers, missionaries, soldiers, and other travelers grappled with the challenges the animals of the New World posed to their essentially medieval worldview. Their struggle to relate the animals they actually encountered to those they had expected to find, and the challenges they faced in communicating what they found to a European readership with its own expectations. Much of this information about these animals was exploited for commercial, political, and religious reasons. Competition for these resources collided with the religious clashes of the Reformation, the copious amount of literature that was published to promote those interests, much of it centered on natural resources of the New World, which included its animals. Now, I've mostly shown you pictures of animals from books, but we don't only find them in books. And of course, I've shown you many pictures already from our medieval encyclopedia, but there's such great images, I just have more. So we have, I think it's a little bird here. But then we do have a fantastical creature. It's a winged dragon wrapped around an initial capital in this illuminated manuscript. And that happens a lot, both in medieval manuscripts and print. Yes?
I'm sorry, I can't contain myself. Would the scribes also be the ones who create the art and the animal?
So the question is, would the scribes be the people to create the art and the animals? Generally not. When you're copying a manuscript, the actual copying of the text is fairly routine. It's often the master of the scriptorium who is the talented artist who does that work, in part because the colored inks are really expensive and the gold leaf even more expensive. Now that doesn't mean that occasionally, if this is done in a monastery or somewhere, that they have a particularly talented monk whose job it is to be the artist who's overseen by the master of the scriptorium. But generally the gold leaf, no matter what, is reserved for the master because of the expense. And it's really hard to do. It's hard to do now with our version of it. It's probably even harder to do then. So, good question. So in addition to books like this, we see animals on book plates, in printers' devices, and on maps. And I'm going to show you some examples of printers' devices for two well-known 16th century Venetian printers. So this is the Sessa family, and I have to confess, I could have shown you a lot more pictures of cats. And I refrained. So, a lot of willpower. The next one, this dolphin wrapped around an anchor, is the mark of Venetian printer Aldus Manutius, who gave us the semicolon and the paperback book and italics, among other things. This is one of our Portolan charts. This is from 1466. Again, it's hand-painted on animal skin. Along the bottom of the map here are animals. And, whoops, wrong way. There's a camel and an elephant. Elephant drawn nowhere near where elephants happen to live. But nevertheless, they're both shown as modes of transportation. They're just not here randomly. But they serve a purpose on the map to indicate that you travel across the desert or in certain parts of the world on these types of animals, which are not found in Northern Europe, for example. This is a world map by Dutch cartographer Johannes Blauw from 1667. And again, you can see animals along the bottom here. And I'm going to zoom in on that. And you see them a little better here. If you look really close, and I couldn't get a close-up of the owl, but the owl has quite an interesting expression on its face. Perhaps not as interesting as the first owl I showed you, but nevertheless, something's going on. This map of Asia is also by a Dutch cartographer named Karel Allard, and it's from 1696. And here he incorporates animals into the cartouche, which is that portion of the map. Sometimes it's in some kind of a frame that gives you the title of the map and sometimes other types of information. And here it says, that he is the cartographer. So we close in on this one, and you can get a better picture. We've got a camel. We have quite a disturbing-looking monkey. And then we have a turtle over here, or perhaps a tortoise, which is kind of angry looking. This type of cartouche was really popular on late 16th, 17th, and 18th century maps. So especially in Allard's maps, the Dutch cartographers in particular like to include people and animals on their maps, whether in the cartouche or somewhere else on the map, to give people the flavor of the people who lived in the place that they were depicting on the map. And that became quite a popular strategy. I was talking to a group of students who were studying the changing view of the city. in a geography class yesterday, and I showed them a map from a book of city maps by some Germans named Braun and Hogenberg. And Braun included on his maps of these cities pictures of people at the bottom, and on sometimes animals, but his focus was the people. And the reason he says that he did that was because, now this was in about 40 years after the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453. And so Europe was very frightened of the possibility of Turkish invasions. And so he put people on the bottom of the maps because they believed that looking at the human form was against the Islamic religion. And if he put people there, they wouldn't look at the maps and therefore use the city maps for military purposes. It's quite fascinating when you dig into why they do some of the things they do and the choices they make when you think, oh, sure, there's people on maps. You know, that's interesting, you like to learn it, but no, that is actually not why he did it. And sometimes the animal is the cartouche itself. So this is a map from 1675 by the English cartographer John Seller, and it's a chart of the West Indies. So all of the rest of the map is on the other side of the Atlantic. But on this side of the map is Africa, to sort of situate where the Atlantic and the West Indies are. And he's chosen to use a West African elephant as his cartouche. And again, an angry elephant. There are a lot of angry animals in the collection, I have to see, and you're going to see more of them. So now, finally, we're going to come to the fantastical section of my presentation today. And once again, from our medieval encyclopedia, I'm going to begin with this image. Now, a quick glance, you think, ah, a mermaid. But look again, and look more closely. It's really a merman. He has a beard and rather well-developed muscles. These fantastical-looking creatures were included in a little book from the early 18th century created by Francois de Serp at the request of the French king for his son, the Dauphin. He wanted his son to learn about the peoples of the world. And I know. And so apparently these are among the important people that the Dauphin needed to learn about. The bishop of the sea could be the cod. The cod was perhaps the most important fish in Europe. It was often called the beef of the sea. And we're still in a period where there's a lot of people who are not eating meat on a regular basis, and so cod was one of the primary fish. So it's done up as the bishop of the sea. Yeah. And then we have the Cyclops, which is unlike any Cyclops I've ever seen. And I would think that, I mean, the Dauphin at this period is only like 8 or 9 years old. I would think this would give him nightmares. Personally, it's probably going to give me nightmares. And it's the floppy rabbit ears that really are the crowning glory of this creature. I don't know. So by now, you've probably been asking yourselves, well, where are the sea monsters? So Hans Egede, who was known as the Apostle of Greenland, not where you thought I was going, is it? He was a missionary to Greenland in the 18th century, and he's also known for his work in creating an Inuit and Danish dictionary. He and his son Paul were both missionaries to Greenland, and he actually was sainted and is considered the patron saint of Greenland now. He wrote one, and his son too, the earliest accounts of actually seeing a sea monster. And so I have both of their accounts on this slide. They're slightly different. Hans didn't actually see the monster. Paul apparently did. And I see that this isn't working very well. So I'm going to read it anyway, so the slide just got oddly formatted. So Hans says, "But none of them are in our time," meaning sea monsters, "by us seen, except terribly big sea creature, which in 1734 was seen in the sea outside the colony at Greenland at 64 degrees. And what was this form? And it was this form and shape, and it was so enormously big creature that its head reached the ship's yard arm, and the body was as thick as the ship and was 3 to 4 times as long. It had a long pointed nose and blew like a whale. It had big broad flippers, and the body seemed to be covered with a carapace, and the skin was wrinkled and rough, kind of like a rhinoceros. It was otherwise created at the rear like a serpent, and when it went under the water, it lifted itself backwards and raised then the tail up from the water a ship's length away from the body." Now, Paul says, "The 6th July, let itself show, be visible, a very horrible sea creature, which rose itself so high over the water that the head of it reached above our big yard arm. It had a long pointed snout, and it blew, spouted like a whale. It had big broad flippers, and the body seemed to be grown or covered with a carapace, and it was very wrinkled and uneven, rough, on its skin. It was otherwise created below like a serpent, and where it went under the water, again threw itself backwards, and raised thereafter the tail up from the water a whole ship's length from the body." So pretty much similar accounts. Hans apparently is bragging about this, and Paul is recounting something that he and some other Danish sailors saw. This is what it looked like. So this is a little map of the harbor at Greenland, and I'll show you a close-up of it. A little Loch Nessie. There are a lot of people who would question whether this was mythological. A lot of scholars, and an extraordinary number of them, have written articles arguing about whether this creature, it was a giant eel, a giant squid, or some kind of whale. I was quite surprised to find so many people thinking that that was worthy of debate. And of course, none of them even considering the possibility that they actually saw what they described. So, the main source for sea monsters in our collection is the Carta Marina of Olaus Magnus, who is the Archbishop of Uppsala. Unhappy with the Mediterranean world's depiction and lack of knowledge of Scandinavia, he wrote a book in 1539 about the Norse peoples and accompanied it with this map. Now, this particular copy is a facsimile printed copy of a printed hand-colored original that no one can identify. The world knows formally that there are 2 surviving copies of the 1539 original printing. This is based on neither of them. Can't find any record of how it ended up in the collection. It does say that it was printed in Malmö, Sweden in 1949. So as far as I know, this is the only copy in existence of this. Back in the 80s or early 90s, the library made placemats out of it and sold them. We also created a website to explain this map, and because we put it out on the internet, when you Google Olaus Magnus and the Carta Marina or this map, our copy is what comes up. And you can also buy a bedspread of our copy on Amazon, I discovered. You can buy numerous prints. It is widely, widely available. But it is laden with sea monsters. And one of the things I tell my students, and I'll show you a close-up of one of the sections, Olaus was very interested in people learning about Scandinavia. And as you can see here, there's all kinds of, let's see, my pointer has frozen. There's all kinds of cultural information and depictions of other animals. There's reindeer, there's fish, there's a giant chicken, down in the bottom right corner there. But he filled the sea with sea monsters. So I tell my students that he wanted people to know about Scandinavia, but he didn't actually want anybody to go there. Now here's another close-up of another section of the map with more sea monsters. And some of them are labeled. This one is the Zephyus. This is a Ballina, which we now use the term for a type of whale. There is something elsewhere called an orca. And here are some more of them. Close up. Now this is a map from the Blau Atlas that I showed you earlier, and you can see that the sea has some of these sea monsters. A giant seahorse, which isn't on Olaus Magnus's map. It also has flying fish, but it does have similar sea monsters. And here's a close-up. The Ballina is this one right here. And we find these Ballinas and other sea monsters on numerous maps throughout the early modern period. But this is one of the earliest sources for them. And so they're marvelous images and great fun. The next slide is a mystery slide. One of my students found this in the collection and took a picture of it, but neglected to write down the book that he got it from. I do know that this is a hand-drawn, hand-colored image that was on a blank page in a printed volume. So I'm still looking for it. One day I will find it and we'll get it up on our Facebook page with the label. Lastly, we have the unicorn. Now, angry unicorn. This is from our medieval encyclopedia. You notice that the cow is looking a little askance at the anger evinced by the unicorn. Later in the same volume, we have another, again, kind of angry unicorn. And in another book, we have unicorns, but their horns are horizontal for some reason. And they look kind of happy, they're prancing. And lastly, we have this book of unicorns. Now, the unicorn's horn was believed to be have medicinal purposes. The first written description that we can find is by a Greek physician named Cetius. And one of the things he talks about in his description is that you can grind up the horn and make a drinking vessel out of it, and it will help cure epilepsy and make you immune to some kind of poisons. Yes? So the question is, why were the animals drawn with angry faces? I don't know, and I'd really like to find out. Most of the idea we have of unicorns today, of course, comes from the French tapestries that show the Virgin and the lovely docile unicorn, very sweet, which makes it, very popular with 12-year-old girls. Not these. These are fierce animals, and the earliest description says that the only way to capture them is that you have to surround them when they take their young to pasture with many men and horses, because they will not desert their offspring. And they will fight you with horns and teeth and heels, and they'll kill as many horses and men as they possibly can. They can be brought down by arrows and spears, but they cannot be captured alive. So this original description discusses them as being incredibly fierce creatures. It's later in the Middle Ages that they get co-opted by Christianity and become more of the charming animal that we are more used to. So here's a close-up of those, and I want to call your attention to two of them. So this is called a camphor, and it is a unicorn, except it is amphibious. It has webbed feet on the back. And lastly, this animal, which is called a Pyrrhosopi. It is somewhat paradoxical because it's a bicorn unicorn. And according to one story I read, and I don't know if this is actually true or not, but it sounded good. It was invented to correct a translation error in Psalm 21 of the Vulgate Bible, in which God is asked to free someone from the unicorn's horns. And instead of correcting the text and changing the plural to singular, the church preferred to preserve the error and invent something somewhat ridiculous, since bicornism was contradictory to unicornicity. What they did was that they said that the Pyrrhusopoi had a single horn that forked. I hope you've enjoyed this romp through the real and fantastical menagerie of the Bell Library. And I'll be happy to answer any additional questions that you may have. We have some time. Sure. They vary in size. So the standard map that could be printed in one panel on the average printer during that period is about the size of the top of this podium. So the oldest Magnus map with all of the sea monsters is actually in 9 panels of about that size. The atlas and the other maps that I showed you that had the animals at the bottom are about this size. Usually manuscript maps could be made a lot bigger because they weren't restricted to the size of the paper and the size of the press. Yes. Oh, I get the microphone.
Just talk right into that.
Oh my. Can you hear me? Doesn't seem like it's doing anything. Oh, it's not on.
Is it working?
No.
Well, I'll repeat your question.
So 2 questions. One is, do you collect movies, like animals in movies, like Star Wars sorts of things? And then the second is, have you ever had to go back and say, yeah, we thought this was a mythical, fantastical beast, but actually it's real, and reclassify them?
Okay, so the first question was, do I collect things that represent the animals in the movies or Star Wars or things like that? And no, because my collection dates to before 1800, so I don't. And that would be very fun, though, wouldn't it? The second question is, have we ever encountered an animal depicted and classified as one animal, but someone has later discovered that is actually a real animal and not a fantastical animal? Yes. In part, things like the water hog, for example, a lot of the animals in the New World, some Europeans just didn't believe what was being described. The rhinoceros is a good example, except that they brought one to Europe and people saw it, which is why Durer's print was so unbelievably popular. But it also explains the armadillo craze. I mean, this is real. But there were lots of other animals that even scholars thought couldn't possibly be real, that later turned out to be actual animals. And that's one of the things behind the sea monsters. You look at the sea monsters and they're huge and outrageous, and most people think, well, they're not real, except we have found actual corollaries in the natural world to these animals. They're semi-extinct. They don't get seen very often because of the nature of the oceans and the nature of how we travel the oceans. And so when we say that they don't exist, they're always finding new creatures of the deep that have a corollary to some of these depictions of sea monsters. Now, I'm pretty sure that the North Sea isn't actually, or the North Atlantic isn't actually just full of sea monsters. But they have found some pretty large whales. They found giant eels, giant squid, other things. So while they're trying really hard to argue, for example, that what Hans Egede and his sons saw had to be something besides what they saw, I would say, let's wait, because we're always finding a new skeleton or something that suggests to us that, no, he actually saw that. And then there's the Loch Ness Monster, so hey. Any other questions? Yes.
So the whale was depicted, you said, on many, many of the maps of especially the Atlantic. Were there that many more whales at the time? And it's been just, or did they love the image of the fearsome whale that other artists chose to include them?
Both. Early on, because they weren't really traveling the Atlantic to the degree that they were in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a fantastical creature that was populating it. And yes, sailors saw it, but you know sailors. So it wasn't until later that they realized what the whale could provide. And so you have this enormous industry that grows up in the North Atlantic and also in the North Pacific. I mean, towns along the eastern seaboard of the United States were founded as whaling settlements because whales were unbelievably prevalent, and now they are not, because they've been pretty much fished out, and which is why it's illegal, and trying to get the whale population back. But yes, there were huge numbers of whales of various kinds. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie. All right, a few reminders for you. We have a tour with Chris. You can meet her in the back corner of the room. We also invite you to see our 3 current exhibits: A Woman's Place, Women and Work, which is in the main gallery; Rapunzel, Peanuts, and Thousand-Year Eggs, which is food in the pre-modern era, and that is on the lower level in the Wallen Center Gallery; and Seeing Child Labor Through the Photography of David Parker, and that is up on the 2nd and 3rd floors, and you can use the elevator on the other side of the building to get there. A reminder that we have a recording that's going to go up on the YouTube channel, so you can see the link right there. Maybe take a photograph of it so you can find it later. And then please join us again on March 6th for 2 presentations: Animals, Vegetables, or Minerals, High-Tech Organisms by Amanda Wick, Interim Archivist of the Charles Babbage Institute Archives, and Where Animals and Humans Meet by Cheryl Fong, Interim Curator of the Northwest Architecture Archives. Thanks again for coming today.